Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another CBI at 10. My name is Liz Mosley. I'm an editor at Tortoise. And as you know, we partner with the CBI to bring you these webinar conversations. It's lovely to see you this morning, and thank you very much to our esteemed panel for joining us. Today, we're going to get into the guts of a conversation that is prompted by the fact we are well and truly now finally on the countdown to COP. It feels like it's just around the corner. We've booked our tickets to Glasgow. Some of us have managed to get hotels, some of us still we're going to be camping. Before we get into the conversation about what to expect, what it is, what's going to happen, whether or not we feel optimistic or not so optimistic about the outcomes of it, I'm going to start this morning with Ray Newton-Smith. Good morning, nice to see you. For what we usually do, which is a sort of what's happened in the last 7 days or so, what do we need to be aware of, scene setting thing. Ray, where are we at with everything?
Well, Liz, it continues to be a pretty crazy autumn, and of course the things that we're really monitoring closely, talking to our members and talking closely with government is around the energy crisis, the supply shortages, and also what we're seeing unfolding in the labour market. And I think particularly on hiring at the moment, we saw the labour market stats came out yesterday, and it confirmed, I think, what we all know, that trying to find people at the moment to grow your business as we reopen the economy, I would say, is the #1 challenge that businesses are facing. And it is a positive story on the one hand. This is the problem we wanted to have as we reopen, rather than dealing with issues around really high unemployment. So I think some of the government schemes have worked, but we're now seeing vacancies at a record high, and it is definitely acute challenges, as we know, within trying to find HGV drivers, and in certain sectors particularly around food and drink manufacturing. And it was good to see last week, of course, the government created something we've been calling for, this new supply chain advisory group, where Sir Dave Lewis is appointed to chair that group. And I think that open dialogue is so important. And I think what we've been calling for is almost having that sort of Cobra style task force between business and government, so that we can really get ahead of the next crisis. It does still feel a bit like we're lurching from one crisis to another, but I think the more we have that open dialogue and we can address the issues before they become so acute. And I think what we're all striving towards is to have a high wage, high skilled, high investment, high productivity economy. We know the only way to sustainable rises in a standard of living is to have that investment. And of course, today we'll be talking about that investment in a low carbon economy. And I think what we've been working on, particularly ahead of the budget, which is in just in 2 weeks' time, is really focusing on the recommendations we need to see that investment, particularly in a transition to a low carbon economy. So, businesses are saying to us, the super deduction that the Chancellor announced at the last budget, has been really helpful in bringing forward some of that investment. But because there's such acute skill and supply shortages, actually, that it's not as powerful as it could be generally. And so what we're saying is we need to start thinking about the landscape post 2023 investment, particularly in low carbon technologies. If we're thinking about our whole infrastructure, take a really long time to plan. So we need to have a tax and regulation landscape that incentivizes that over the long term. So those are some of the really clear messages, and particularly also around business rates reform, because I know we'll go on to talk about the built environment, but business rates really influences our built environment. And at the moment, our system still disincentivizes some of that investment in making our buildings more energy efficient. And so that's one of our key asks, I think, that we're putting forward to the Chancellor when, Tony and I will be going to see him next week to really set out a case of what we think needs to happen at that budget. So there's been absolutely plenty to keep us busy over the last couple of weeks.
Well, how exciting, going to see the Chancellor with your budget asks, and I'm sure he'll get his checkbook out and give you everything you dreamed of, Rain. We'll look forward to hearing the feedback from that. Now, party conferences are done. That fun game has come to a close again for another year. I saw Tony's write-up of it on LinkedIn yesterday. Before we come to Peter Smith and Sarisher, let us know what's the CBI going to be doing at COP? What can we expect? Is a program of events? Is it us? Is it behind the scenes meetings? What are you going to be doing, or what are you going to be asking for in the COP world?
Yeah, so I think for us, really, COP, I mean, I think first and foremost, what we want to see is really ambitious commitments by individual countries to reducing their carbon emissions. That is what COP is all about. Of course, everyone thinks back to Paris, where there were really, ambitious commitments to ensuring a transition, that we're only have a 1.5 degree warming, and we have sort of net zero targets by the middle of this century, and we've got many countries signed up to that, but we need more countries signed up, and we need to have clear, credible plans as to how they will lower carbon emissions over the next 5 years. So that's the first and foremost. I think secondly, it's really about the race to the top and what businesses themselves are doing at an individual level to make their own commitments around net zero. And we've been working with our Goal 13 impact platform, sharing some of the case studies that businesses themselves are doing, and we'll be absolutely focused on showcasing that over the weeks at COP. Thirdly, it's really about driving the policy outcomes. Of course, we're very focused on that in the UK. We've got the 10-point plan. We need to see more of that detail underneath, and we'll be continuing to push on that. And I think it's also ensuring we have a legacy beyond COP. COP is a moment in time, and we'll be madly busy. We've got a whole series of events on Thursday. We're looking at the first Thursday of COP. We have an event around sustainable finance and the energy transition. And then the following Thursday, looking at clean transport and nature and biodiversity. And we're going to be broadcasting every day from COP, showcasing what some businesses are doing on many of those issues. But I think what everyone wants to see is that we have lots of events that showcase what's happening over those 2 weeks, but that we have a lasting impact beyond. And of course, that's about policy, but it's also about the actions that businesses are taking on the ground.
Thanks ever so much, Rain. There certainly is a lot going on. I wonder if I might come to Peter next. Peter Betts was previously the Director of International Climate Change at the Department for Energy and the EU lead negotiator on climate. So you've been in the room, Peter, when these kinds of negotiations are taking place. Rain mentioned the sort of ambitious commitments as one of the key things, and a hard set of policy actions that will show the link between the commitment and the delivery of it. Just tell us a bit about what COP actually is and what will happen. How do those commitments and those policy actions come about? It's sort of everybody flocks to Glasgow and mills around a conference centre, but then what?
So a COP is two things. It's the world's biggest multilateral negotiation, and it's also a giant trade fair. So tens of thousands of people, typically, maybe fewer this year with COVID, come together and talk about climate. The COP negotiations are extremely complicated. Scores and scores of issues being discussed all the time. Because they're agreed by consensus, things tend to go very slowly, and everything tends to come together at the end. Actually, there's relatively little to negotiate at this COP. This is a sort of common issue I see in the press and elsewhere, that there's an expectation that there's some grand new agreement going to be negotiated. Actually, there's relatively little. I'll come maybe as we progress to what could be negotiated, but it's much of the real action is what happens before the COP, as well as some of the big real economy announcements which are made at the COP, but which are not formally part of the COP, like sort of coalitions of companies and businesses and so on.
So in that spirit then, if much of the sort of, if you like, the effect of COP, the success of it this time round is determined beforehand, do we already know whether it is going to deliver what we know we need it to deliver?
So we know some of the picture. So I don't want to blind people with numbers, but you know, the United Nations Environment Program Gap report, which comes out every year, says basically we need around getting on for 30 gigatons, 30 billion tons of additional abatement in 2030 to be on track for 1.5 degrees, and we need 15 or so to be on track for 2 degrees. So what have we got? We've got commitments at the very top end of what we thought we might get from the big developed countries. You can argue about whether they'll deliver those, but they give us about 4 gigatons, a bit south of 4 gigatons.
Wow.
We've got a bunch of emerging economies who said we're not moving.
Yeah.
Unreported broadly in the British press. Indonesia, Mexico, Russia, Brazil. And then we've got a bunch of big economies who haven't come out yet. Above all, China, its emissions are bigger than the developed world. So we don't know what China's going to do. We were expecting it to have come forward already, but they haven't. So we'll see. Maybe it could even be at the COP, who knows? But even if China do something dramatic, we might double that 4 gigatons. So we might get to 8 or even 9, but we're not going to get to 29 or which we need for 1.5, or 15 we need for 2. That doesn't mean it's all doom and gloom. First of all, that is a very substantial additional chunk of abatement, which brings us closer to a sort of 2-degree trajectory. And secondly, I do think the sort of trends in the real economy are way ahead of what that headline story the NDCs are telling us. And I think we are going to see, and we might hear a bit about this later from some of your other brilliant panelists, you know, we are seeing some really powerful sort of real economy and finance coalitions which will be launched at the COP, which really speak to how far that real economy and finance agenda is ahead of the headline story in the NDCs.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks so much, Peter. And you absolutely didn't blind us with numbers. It's very helpful to think in terms of there's 4, what it would take to get to 8, and actually what we need to do is be getting closer to 30. I think that's just a simple picture, albeit a rather frightening one. I'm going to come to Smith, and I will come back to Peter as we go along. Now, Smith, you are in the sustainability team at a building consultancy, effectively. Just give us a 2-line version of what it is your organisation does at Buro Happold.
So Buro Happold are an international engineering and consultancy and advisory practice. There are about 2,000 engineers and consultants, economists, you know, architects, lots and lots of different kinds of people working across disciplines, working on the built environment sort of very broadly, so from individual buildings and projects to master plans to portfolios to cities, and sort of well, work really centres around trying to make the built environment more sustainable.
And so the people who are your clients might be the city of Aberdeen, I'm making it up. They might be a big developer, but just give us a sense. And they come to you and they say, okay, Smith, how can we change what's already there, or how can we build new stuff better?
Yeah, it could be either of those or both of those. It could be that there's a specific project, a specific building that a group or a firm or whatever needs, in which case it's around doing the engineering. And so sort of from structural engineering and fire engineering and some of the specialist things like that to sort of more holistic sustainability strategies around specific projects. Or it might be more about, okay, we have this portfolio of buildings that we are currently managing, and maybe want to sort of develop over the next 20 years. Like, how do we make a strategy that makes sure that that is done as sustainable as possible? Or it might be more around, okay, we're a city or we're a local authority and we want to have a strategy to make sure that the way that we procure projects and the way that we sort of incentivize the work that happens within our region, how do we make that kind of sustainable and make the infrastructure work and so on. So it really happens at all different scales, yeah.
So we were mentioning before we went live that the built environment as a sort of pillar of the climate change conversation, I think you said it was a sort of best kept secret. I hear a lot about energy transition, I hear a lot about transport, but built environment, not so much. I'm wondering, first of all, why do you think that is? And secondly, what are some of the big questions really that we ought to be asking and fielding? I know there's a built environment day at COP, but just tell us why it is that we don't think about houses, offices and all the other stuff in the same way that we think about, I don't know, windmills and ships and things.
Yeah, so the built environment accounts for about 38% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And so 28%, so 30% is around the operation of our existing building stock, so sort of heating, cooling, and so on. So we use a huge amount of energy, and that's through electricity, but also, you know, through gas and direct emissions as well. And then another 10% is sort of even more thorny in a way, which is around the emissions embodied in the materials and construction processes used to create new buildings. So, you know, if you're making bricks, there are emissions emitted in the course of creating those bricks. There are, you know, diesel-powered machinery on site and so on. And so those are the kind of two big areas. And a lot of the construction industry has been sort of around regulation, has historically been focused on the operational emissions of new buildings. But that's only a really small amount of that overall picture of around 40%. What we need to do is focus much more on that, the operational emissions associated with the existing built environment, you know, depending on where you are, but it's estimated that around half of the buildings that will exist in 2050 have already been built. So we can't only be worried about the sort of the new buildings that we build, we have to worry about the existing buildings. And that varies from country to country. In the UK, it's about 80% probably of the buildings that exist in 2050 have already been built. So we have to retrofit and work there. And then there's also this point about the emissions that are released into the atmosphere in the course of building the new building. So looking at the kind of materials that we build with and the processes that we use to construct them.
So let's talk about that adaptation frame then of the building I'm sitting in, the building you're sitting in now. I know that your organisation has set its own net zero carbon targets. I'm guessing that the emissions from the buildings that you use to do your work in is a chunk of that. Just talk to us about how you came up with your target, what it is, and what are the sort of pieces of pie that make up that target, I guess.
Yeah, sure. So consultants working in the built environment, we have to have a couple of different targets because of the kind of work that we do. So we are net zero in our own operation. So in terms of our own offices, you know, the energy that we use, the way that we've retrofitted our existing our offices and so on, you know, the way that we decide whether or not we're going to travel to a meeting or not, you know, all of those decisions, we've reduced those as much as possible, and we're sort of using high quality offsets to kind of balance the rest until that's completely sort of absolute zero, which we're working towards. But that's only a really small amount of the influence that we as built environment consultants have on the environment. We also need to look at the operational energy of the buildings that we design and that we help to manage and so on, and then that embodied carbon of our new buildings. So we also have targets around making sure that all our new build projects are net zero carbon in operation by 2030, and that we are reducing the embodied carbon intensity of all our projects by half by 2030 as well. So that's to do with working on the projects that we actually design, even though they're not included in our own kind of scope in a way, but we have a huge influence over them. And so that's what the built environment industry as a whole is sort of really woken up to over the last couple of years. Like, we have a huge responsibility, we have a huge potential, and to be that really transformational force.
If you're watching the call this morning and you're running a business that isn't a built environment business, but obviously has a built environment component, it's got shops, it's got offices, whatever it is, and I can't think of a business that doesn't have at least a bit of that. What is the way of understanding, what are the questions you should be asking? Where do you go to find out, okay, well, this is my benchmark now, and what do I need to do to get, you know, from A to B?
Yeah, sure. So I think this reduce, reuse, recycle thing that everybody knows can be applied to the built environment. It has a sort of a specific sort of approach within the built environment. But so when we're talking about reduce there, maybe it's around optimizing the use of existing buildings and resources. So depending on the kind of business, but, you know, when we're working with, for example, sort of hospitals or schools, you know, it's about making sure that we're using the existing buildings and resources we have as efficiently as possible. And we've worked with projects to make sure that, you know, actually you don't need to build a new building, you need to change the way that you're using your existing building to make sure that there's sort of as equal and fair access and sort of sensible access to as much of it as possible. So it's about reducing our demand for buildings where that's possible in some ways. Then in terms of reuse, we need to reuse and refurbish our existing stock. So and that's both the fabric retrofit, so thinking about things like insulation and overhangs and double glazing and things like that, so that, you know, you don't have to keep it plugged in order to reduce the energy use. And then those actives are around, you know, updating your machinery and equipment that you use to operate the building and making sensible decisions. And so, you know, it's incredible sometimes that you go into, you look at how a building is being operated and actually there's heating and cooling on at the same time. You know, there's all kinds of weird things that are happening. So around reuse, yeah, just thinking about retrofitting that your existing stock. And then for recycled, this kind of relates to that final point. So when we do need to build new buildings or make major extensions to existing buildings, as much as possible, build them from recycled and reclaimed materials. And this is where we need to have a much more circular economy within construction, where we do need new materials, try to build them with bio-based materials first, so timber and sort of other materials that have grown. Anything that's grown has taken in carbon, so that's the kind of ideal. So there's a kind of hierarchy of things that need to be done. It's not simple and it's different for every project, and I think that's part of the, you know, to answer your previous questions, part of the reason it's so complicated within the built environment. It's a really complex system, but at the end of the day, I think, you know, the industry does have the tools and skills to do this. It's just about how we organize ourselves and the project management of it all that is where we're going to be able to unlock it.
Thanks so much, Smith. There's tons to think about. I mean, in many ways, it is complicated, and I know that there's a lot to do. And when think about building work, I don't know if everybody's like me. I just kind of think, oh God, please no, in any scenario. But it is sort of just really the same way you think about your house. You know, how do I make it so I don't have to have the heating on? We'll close the windows, and you know, all of that. It's similar principles, but just perhaps on a different scale and with a different frame, different levels of disruption as well. I guess. I just want to say a quick note to. I think there's some kind of funny weirdness going on with the webinar settings, and some people can only hear us and not see us. We are gorgeous, so that's a shame for you, but you can watch it back. It's being recorded, so if you want to see the picture version as well, or some people have had some success coming off their laptops and going in on more like an iPad or a phone, and that seems to be working. Anyway, I just wanted to flag that if you think it's just you, it's not just you. There's a few people having that problem. Let's go to Sarisher now, if we can. Sarisher Mann, you're Sustainable Finance Engagement and Communications Manager for BNP Paribas, which is obviously a massive bank. And the sustainable finance bit of this is obviously one of the really powerful levers that we need to yank really hard to accelerate the commitments and on the delivery. Just sort of explain to us in sort of layman's terms, what is that lever? How does sustainable finance help in the acceleration towards net zero?
Sure. So I guess what's interesting about relating it to what other panelists mentioned is how finance could really try and transition the real economy to net zero. So I'd say a lot of what we're seeing now is the integration of environmental targets, in particularly sustainability linked finance. And so that's becoming quite BAU and mainstream in the way that finance is working. So we're seeing this very interesting transition of new forms of knowledge and new forms of targets, and the discussion with many of our corporate and institutional clients, for example, at BNP Paribas, has moved so much from talking about some of the kind of economic drivers to actually talking about some of the sustainability drivers. And the two are becoming really intertwined in terms of the way that finance could actually accelerate the transition to net zero. And concretely across a couple of sectors, I can give some examples of what's happening. So I'd say the first big thing we've seen over the last few years is the integration of decarbonisation targets into the way that finance is being structured for companies. So there's a new wave of what's called sustainability linked finance, where this is both in a primarily capital market, so bonds and loans, so forms of debt that companies can take on to do investments in terms of infrastructure or their supply chain to retrofit that. That's really become a huge area of development for sustainable finance. And I think all of the banks that have committed to the Net Zero Banking Alliance, for example, which is a kind of industry-wide coalition, are looking at that as a form of innovation to try and transition companies in terms of net zero. So what does that look like? Essentially, if you look at lots of different sectors of the economy, Smith mentioned the built environment, and I think we're seeing the integration of some really interesting sustainability targets around circularity into companies' financing strategies. So, for example, we're seeing food waste targets being integrated into loan agreements. We're seeing energy efficiency targets in terms of green bond frameworks. We're seeing a real new form of finance, which is trying to embed a very concrete material environmental narrative. And I think the thing that's kind of important to understand is the materiality of those sectors. So all of the companies that are on this call today have transition pathways, and they might have targets on scopes of emissions. And I think the critical thing for COP in particular is to understand how finance can try and integrate those targets into the way that we actually support those companies, because that's where it can be a real lever to accelerate. And so understanding these new forms of knowledge around what are different scopes of emissions for different sectors is very important. And it's something that at the bank we're really looking quite extensively at, but not looking at it alone. I think that's what's quite interesting about going into this COP, is that a lot of the knowledge that needs to be included within integrating sustainable finance mainstream is actually not within finance. So we have to work with lots of different experts like Smith and others that are from their respective sectors to try and understand what does the transition pathway of a company look like, of a sector, and ensure that finance is trying to actually be a material lever rather than something where there's no additionality. And I think that point on additionality and embedding the right kind of material science into the way finance works is going to be essential as we move forward.
Thanks, Sarisher. I'm going to come back to Peter in a second because I want to ask some follow-up questions from him, reflecting on what yourself and Smith have said. But before we go in, for COP26 specifically, you will be up there, I guess, and people from your organisation will be up there. What are you trying to do when you're there? Are you trying to communicate with other people? Are you trying to learn? What are going to be the outcomes, really? How will it catalyse some of the things that you've been talking about?
Sure. So I think what's kind of interesting about this COP, and I went to COP21 with BNP Paribas in Paris, and I think we're at a very different point in time in terms of the engagement, particularly of corporates and where they are with their sustainability strategies. So I think a lot of the COP for us will be engagement with companies that are trying to transition their business to net zero and understand what is it that finance needs to do to actually support that transition. Is it to look at, for example, leasing solutions whereby they can actually try and change the way that they finance in terms of the circularity of the asset? Is it to look at types of targets that they have around energy efficiency and understand how is it that can be embedded in the way that finance can support them? Is it more that they actually need to work with startups? And I think that's a huge area of development for working as an intermediary between the innovators and also the companies that are already quite scalable and embedded in what they're doing in terms of supply chain. And I think as a bank, we're trying to operate on all three of those areas. So not only on the innovation in the real economy, but also how can we, for example, support clean tech and match that with clients that we have. So trying to really change the narrative to engagement versus kind of going and saying, here's everything that we do as a bank. I think it's a huge learning opportunity, and it's a huge engagement opportunity too, to work with people that might be at the cutting edge but that currently don't necessarily use finance as a lever, but that could support them to accelerate much faster towards their net zero target than current credentials, for example.
Thanks so much. Peter, I'm really interested to know how you respond to some of the things that Smith is saying, what Sarisher is saying. You've obviously, like I said before, you've been in the room, you've been doing the negotiations, talking specifically about government commitments. And we mentioned before we went live that I believe that there is now an urgency in the business and commercial sector. People really understand that we have to get there quickly, we have to do the targets, and it's not just a thing that you have to tell the shareholders that it looks like you're doing it and pull out the brochure. I'm just wondering, how do you feel, but it still also feels like we're in wondering about it, what's the best way mode as well. And I wonder if you, essentially the question is, do you buy it? Do you buy it that the business, community are fully locked and loaded and doing everything that they can to get there faster, or not?
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, I do think, because I talk to a lot of businesses, including at senior level, and I think there's been a real shift over the last few years. Of course, there are some businesses who are not there, who are sitting on the fence, or some who are looking at opportunities in the brown economy still. But I think there has been a huge shift, and I think that is vastly important. It creates political space for government, and as we were saying before, it's in many cases ahead of where NDCs and so on are. If you look at the targets in the developed world, they are outside, say, Australia, they are extremely challenging, but the policies are not in place yet, broadly speaking. Those policies are going to come unless you think that governments are going to back off these targets in a few years' time, which I don't believe they can do. So there's going to be a real ramping up of policy. I think there's going to be growing anger. We're seeing it from the youth and so on. I think there's going to be reputational risks for companies who don't go down this path. So I think I talked to a lot of senior business people. They are serious. I think there's some cases they're legitimately struggling. Well, how do I do this? You know, how do I use offsets? How do I avoid the reputational risks and so on? But I'm convinced there. So I applaud those businesses, and the more they do it for their businesses and maybe for their sector. That's the most important thing that businesses can do.
Just on that point on offsetting, do you buy offsetting, or is offsetting really a license to pollute?
So I am not sort of ideologically opposed to offsetting, as some are, but there are clearly risks to offsetting. There are risks of double counting. There are risks of sort of leakage if it's forest. So we definitely need a proper rules framework, and it's not, that is going to have to emerge both top down and bottom up, and it's not there yet. And I can see that, and I think for forest offsets, I think in the end it's going to need sovereign backers. It's going to need the governments in these countries to stand behind it because of issues of leakage and so on. But I do think it's where we will go. But I can well understand that businesses, looking at this, sort of have fears of reputational risk and so on in the short term, if they can't be really assured that these are high quality offsets.
Yeah. Interesting. Smith, a question's come in from Eunice Malik, who's watching, that I think is probably best if I knock it onto you, which is: buildings should be in use 24 hours a day. 65% of commercial buildings are only in use 60% of the time. How do you change that? Is that something that you kind of work with your clients that come to you to say, well, I've got this real estate, how do I make sure it doesn't sit there, empty? Yeah, no, absolutely. And that sort of relates to that first point around kind of the reduce that I was mentioning. But for example, we have a project that I love using as an example, where it was a hospital actually, and they came to us and they said, we've got £3 million and we need an extension because we need this additional space. We sort of said, okay, well, hang on a minute, let's just have a look at how you're using all of your existing, it's a huge campus of different buildings being used in different ways, and through analysing how it was used over the 24-hour period, over the week, by different parties and so on, we were able to just reconfigure how those existing spaces were used and save them the £3 million, so that we didn't need to create that extension, but also then you don't need to sort of have the knock-on embodied carbon impacts of that. And we need to think more holistically and about not only how, so it's easy within sort of one ownership kind of package, right? If you've got one portfolio or one campus or one estate, then it's easier to do that. But when you're thinking about, how are buildings used within a city, or how are buildings used within a country or broader and so on, thinking about the housing crisis, for example, we have huge amounts of people who are in overcrowded and substandard housing, and then we have another, lots and lots of underoccupied buildings and so on. We have to address those kinds of the distribution and access to those resources. Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks ever so much, Smith. A question's come in for Peter. You mentioned, Peter, at the beginning that there's not actually that much left to negotiate at COP. It's, maybe there'll be a big announcement for China, but in terms of negotiations, there's not much left. But there is some things. Could you let us know what the some things are that are still to be sort of thrashed out a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the main, there's a huge number of technical things that, but the things that are politically resonant, the rules around Article 6, the carbon market. There's some rules around transparency, how that operates, discussions around loss and damage, discussions around adaptation and how the amount of finance that goes in adaptation, and how the adaptation, the so-called adaptation goal, can be operationalized. I also think that there is already pressure emerging for some kind of roadmap out of Glasgow, because we know we will make a big step forward. We know it won't be enough. We know that already. And I think essentially saying, well, we're going to come back in 2025 and see you then. I don't think that's going to wash politically. I think there's going to be some need for some new political moment between now and 2025, and I think that will be quite contentious to get that agreed.
Why would it be contentious?
Because some countries would see it as another opportunity to put pressure on them to raise their ambition.
Oh, I see. Yeah. What do you think the chances are of China coming out with a big announcement at COP?
So I think they will come out with an announcement. I talk to lots of people who know China much better than I do, and they basically don't know. I think there are lots of reasons why China could do something transformational, because it's in China's interest. They want to get up the value chain. They are vulnerable to climate change themselves. They do care a bit about their international reputation, especially in the developing world, and they're sensitive to what those countries think. On the other hand, there are those in China who are saying, well, what about energy security? They're just, what about the risk we're going to be trapped by these targets, our growth? So I think those debates are playing out in China as they are here. And in the end, it will be President Xi who will take the call, is what I am told. And, people don't know. If I were really guessing, I'd say they would do something modest that preserves their space, because that's your preference from the past. But I don't know.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. I like it when people can't quite be drawn. I wanted you to say, well, yes, this is what it's going to be, and we'll all put money on it. Smith, I don't know if this is a fair question. Actually, Sarisher might have a point of view as well. One of the things we've talked about again and again and again, sometimes on these CBI webinars and sometimes in conversations I have with other companies, is this thing of, everybody's obsessed with hybrid working, and some people have gone back to the office and some people are doing half, and companies are trying to do the sums, really the calculations on whether a blended working model, I'm talking about sort of traditionally office-based organizations, I guess, whether some people being at home, some people being at work, the saving of the emissions on the commuting, whether it's a sort of good, bad or indifferent thing, and people really struggling to get a sense of that. Maybe do you want to go first? Do you have a sense of how that falls in terms of an individual organization's own emissions?
Honestly, we're working it out at the moment, and I'm on a sort of personal note, I'm really grateful that I'm working at Buro Happold, because they're very, very flexible and open about, like, okay, now you can come into the office as much or as little as you like, whatever makes sense for you and your team and so on. Whereas I've found that some of my friends are being forced to go in even when it doesn't feel safe and so on. But that does mean that it's maybe a little bit more difficult for us to predict exactly how this is all going to fall out. How much space do we actually need in the office? What do the offices need to look like now? How does that all need to be managed? What does that mean for energy use? We've had buildings that we've sort of semi-mothballed over the last months because it just was costing much too much in terms of money and carbon, in terms of keeping them operational when they weren't being used and so on. And then you've got that vacant building situation. So then, what do we have to do with that? But also trying to respond to people's own needs and ensuring that we've got that flexible working. So I think we're going to have to see over the next few months and years how that's all going to fall out exactly. I think the other thing is about that we're considering more is, like, how do we support individuals who are then working from home more to make sure that that any uplift in energy that therefore comes from the home, supporting people around retrofitting in their own homes, for example, or renewable energy supplies and so on, and figuring out how all that works. I don't have the answer yet, but we're working on it.
I think that's where everybody is. Sarisher, are you in the same sort of place at Paribas? You've obviously got your own, here's our targets, but that was calculated based on knowing, and everybody got on the train and came to work in the same building.
Yeah, I think again, from our perspective, it boils down to the materiality of the emissions. So particularly for quite service-based businesses, a lot of the emissions might be scope 3. So as much as we try to reduce our operational footprint, I think it's important to consider what the materiality of emissions of the business are. I think we're doing some quite interesting things around looking at how to heat buildings efficiently, and I know we're working with a couple of interesting innovators on that in terms of using a lot of renewable energy. Also looking at how to, it's an interesting project in France where we reused some of the heating from the building, in particular some of the service centres for social housing and heating social housing. And I think there's an interesting interplay, and I think Smith mentioned it earlier around the human factor in all of these emissions discussions. I think we shouldn't necessarily forget the importance of the just transition, and that's a really blasé term at the moment in terms of people saying just transition is really important, but we're really trying to assess, okay, what does that mean? How can we actually support the just transition? And I think one thing we shouldn't forget with COP is this interplay of two critical factors that are going to be important that aren't necessarily as talked about now, especially within sustainable finance. I think one is the social aspect. We're seeing some interesting innovations around social KPIs being integrated into environmental products as well. So for example, social housing, there's a couple of interesting developments where social housing companies have actually done sustainability linked loans, not only including energy efficiency, but also looking at how to support the residents to get back into employment. So it's considering this balance of both social and environmental. And I think the other factor is nature. I think often that the second week of COP does address some elements of biodiversity, and I think trying to address that in the context of just transition in some regions is very important. So we just got back from Greenland actually on an expedition with BNP Paribas and a company called Ground Truth, and that was really trying to understand what are the social implications of transition in countries that are affected by climate change. So how can you ensure that you've got that balance of the right type of employment, digitalization as a factor for citizens? So I think the interplay of social and environmental is going to be very important as we look ahead to what is materiality coming out of COP.
Thank you, Sarisher. My final question is going to go to Peter. It's the horrible question, actually, but it was on the brief, so hopefully you've had the opportunity to think about it before it comes, which is there'll be, there's 80 people watching this morning, all of whom are running businesses. They could be large, they could be small, they could be all kinds of sectors. If we take it as read that already the people who are running these businesses are engaging with their own net zero journeys, they're thinking about the way they construct their products, manufacture, whatever it might be, what then now at this point in time, if you already feel that you're kind of you're ticking all the boxes that you need to tick, what's your one ask of those people in relation to the next, I guess it's the next few weeks, how with COP coming up, what's the ask of business now, really?
I mean, over the next few weeks it's quite hard, but I do think what we're seeing is sectors coming together and working out how they're going to make the sort of, I hate the word, this journey together. We've got net zero targets from many, but there aren't very many rules around what constitutes a good target, and basically it's been left to each sector to do that. So I'd really encourage sectors to really think this through together once they've made progress on their own business, and then once they've done that, they can work internationally and they can pressure governments to provide sensible, efficient, orderly frameworks so that their business, their sector can progress. So it starts at home, but then gradually working out from there, I would say.
Brilliant. It's a good tip. Sectors working together will be the next frontier. And we're into our last minute. I want to say go on. Smith's got her hand up.
Sorry, can I just take this opportunity that I know that we've posted it in the chat, but if anybody is on the call is involved in the built environment, we've got this report built for the environment that we're taking to COP, and we're looking for as many endorsements of the recommendations in that report as possible. It's all around the kind of the systems thinking and sectors working together and sort of infrastructure and so on that we've been talking about. So if you do agree with the recommendation of the report, I'd love your endorsement. Thank you.
Excellent plug at the end. Thank you very much to our esteemed panel this morning, to Smith and Rain and Peter and Sarisher. Next week on Wednesday, it will be Law Bill Amoria on trade. The week after that is Rain again, looking at the budget and spending review after her meeting with the Chancellor. And then it's COP. So we really are in the countdown. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time this morning. Have a great rest of Wednesday. As I always say, go and put the kettle on, have a cup of tea, or you open your emails. Have a good rest of the day. Thanks ever so much, everybody. Bye-bye.